Hello, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We're so happy to see 130 people joining us today. It's so wonderful to be able to be with you all on our 6th session of our 2022 Racial Justice Training Series. Those of you who have been with us before know that during our sessions this year, we have explored a chapter of Professor Chris Henning's book, The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth. In our past sessions, youth defenders, impacted young people, youth justice advocates, and academic scholars have all joined Professor Henning in discussing the impact of government systems and societal bias on Black, Latino, and other groups of young people who are subjected to prejudice in this country. Using Rage of Innocence as a foundation, our past panelists have discussed adolescence, including the basic characteristics of adolescence, the importance of recreation and play for young people, youth expression of culture, and youth identity development, all within the context of how America prohibits Black and Latino youth from benefiting from these life stages. Today's panel is going to be amazing because we will be using chapter 6 of the book, Cops in Schools, to launch a conversation about closing the school to prison pipeline. Now, while the book focuses specifically on the issue of cops in schools, today's discussion will cover the wider context of how school policies and procedures, including those that involve cops, work to push out children of color into the juvenile legal system. We'll also talk about the role that youth defenders have in combating this, along with how youth defenders in this community can work with youth and families to engage in reform and revolution on the school to prison pipeline. Now, to introduce our panel, we're going to do something a little different. I'm going to give you a very brief summary of their achievements, and then I'm going to turn to them to tell us in 60 discrete, specific seconds why they are passionate about this type of reform or about the abolition of schools having police officers. We're going to have someone drop the full bio for each of our panelists here so that you have them in the chat. So first, we're going to start off with Chris, also known as Professor Henning. Chris is the Bloom Professor of Law and Director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative at Georgetown. She has represented young people in DC's Superior Court for more than 3 decades. She has inspired and taught an untold amount of youth advocates as well as youth defenders, including myself. She trains a wide array of justice stakeholders on the role of race in the juvenile legal system. And of course, she is the author of The Rage of Innocence. Chris.
All right. In 60 seconds flat, just as you said, Ebony, I've been representing kids accused of delinquency for 26 years, and the vast majority of those children have been Black children. And over the years, so many of those children have been arrested at and referred from schools, right, for normal adolescent behaviors, just doing what kids do. And the presence of police officers in schools makes that so much worse. And so I have become especially passionate about eradicating the school to prison pipeline.
Thank you, Chris. Wonderful job and wonderful mission. Next, we're going to turn to Dr. Amir Whitaker. Amir is a senior policy counsel at the ACLU of Southern California. He has represented incarcerated youth throughout Florida and Alabama, and has taught across multiple educational disciplines for more than a decade. In his scholarship, he has authored multiple publications about the school to prison pipeline, one with one of our panelists, Mr. Jordan. He also founded Project KnuckleHead, a program to inspire vulnerable youth and help them reach their potential through education, music, and art programs. He is affectionately known by them as Dr. KnuckleHead. Amir.
Thank you for that, Ebony, and thank you all for hosting this panel. I'm honored to join you. This comes from, as you mentioned, scholarship. I've seen the research that confirms the harms of school police, but also personal experiences. I'll never forget, you know, when I was in middle school, one of the most intimidating experiences, the police officer just took me in the office and sat me down and put handcuffs in between us at the table and just looked at me. And that was essentially the threat of violence, right? Where I was a 12-year-old kid, and they got away with that, and they get away with a lot more abuses. And, you know, they're not trained to serve and support our students. And we see what that looks like. Our students have, you know, maybe an emotional issue, or sometimes is just doing typical adolescent behavior. You know, they're subjected to harm. So whereas counselors and others are trained to respond to students, the officers are there to train to respond to crime or to punish students. And we know that harm students. So it's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Amir. It's great to have you. Next, Harold Jordan. Harold is the Nationwide Education Equity Coordinator at the ACLU of Pennsylvania. He's authored multiple publications, including Beyond Zero Tolerance, Discipline in Pennsylvania Schools. He recently served on the Pennsylvania Commission of Crime and Delinquency's Behavioral Health and School Climate and Threat Assessment Work Group, and on the coordinating committee of the National Dignity in Schools campaign. He has been an advocate in this work for several decades. Harold?
Hi. My concerns about these issues actually go back to involvement in education issues. I grew up in the South, in Georgia, during a period where people were fighting about school resources, equitable resources, et cetera. And I, as a student, was in the middle of those struggles. Later on in life, when I became a parent, I began to see those struggles in a slightly different way. And what were sort of inequities in resources, it turns out, were reflected in differences in how kids were treated when it came to discipline and removal and exclusion from school. And in general, my view is that school is a place of hope for parents and guardians. And it's a place where our kids are supposed to advance and learn things and move forward in life. And to see that stunted by disciplinary practices, et cetera, is extremely alarming. It is not just a question of inequitable resources, it's inequities in how kids are treated at every stage.
Absolutely. I cannot wait to get into further discussion on that. Before we do, our last panelist, certainly not the least panelist, is Reyna Rololazzo. Reyna is a proud Filipina and the Community Engagement and Anti-Racism Director for the Washington State organization TeamChild. She coordinated the South King County Discipline Coalition, where she worked alongside community leaders who share a vision to end the disproportionate discipline of students of color that pushed them into the school to prison pipeline. Reyna, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here and to learn from all of these other panelists. I can't even believe I'm here with you. My influence was really my family story. My family immigrated from the Philippines, and probably like a lot of other immigrant stories, our belief system was around education being the way to securing success and safety for your family. That's at least the narrative at the time. And being that what it was, we were able to accomplish that. But going through Seattle public schools, where I went through, I saw that clearly wasn't a real opportunity for all of my classmates. And so that influenced me to say, what can I do to make education actually that opportunity for all students? And so that brought me to TeamChild, which is a nonprofit law firm in Washington that provides civil legal aid to youth around 12 to 14 years old, primarily around education, but also healthcare and housing. So that's what brought me, is my own family narrative around education being a way to security and safety, and trying to make that true.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our panelists. I cannot wait to dig in. And so why wait? Let's just go ahead and dig in. So we're going to have our discussion today kind of broken up into two sections. So first, we're going to talk about school discipline before we dig into the cops and schools part. So I want to start off by talking about racial disparities in school discipline. And so I'm going to start with Harold and Amir. And I think I'd like to ask Harold to answer this question first. So like people are probably loosely familiar with the disparities in school discipline, but if you could set the stage by just giving us a quick summary of the data that we have on racial disparities in schools. And again, this is before we talk about SROs or cops in schools, just give us a baseline.
Well, I mean, what is remarkable about school discipline disparities is that these disparities, especially by race and disability, exist across the spectrum of categories of discipline. So if you look at in-school suspension, detention, moving to out-of-school suspension one time, out-of-school suspension more than once, referral to law enforcement, that is, anytime the police are called to intervene with students, regardless of the outcome, to arrest. So the patterns with regard to race and disability exist across that spectrum. And indeed, the General Accountability Office concluded that in its analysis of discipline. So we're not talking about a problem that is just in one area, that is out of school suspension or expulsion. The same patterns exist across the spectrum of types of discipline. So according to the US Department of Education and a report that they put out and a slide deck they put out in June of 2021, Black students received in-school suspensions and out-of-school suspensions at more than twice their share of student enrollment. And that is the pattern that you see. You also see disproportionality in different areas. And a Black student with a disability is the student who is most likely to be suspended out of school in most states. The few exceptions are in a few states in which there are large numbers of Indigenous students, and their numbers are high as well. So that is a pattern that is pretty consistent across the United States with both suspensions and arrests. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Harold. And so I know that you and Amir wrote a publication together, it's Counselors, Not Cops, right? And so I want to follow up on that with Amir and ask you if you have anything to add as we drop that publication in the chat for our audience to be able to see.
Absolutely. And I'm also going to drop in the chat a publication I did with the ACLU right before that was specifically on school discipline. So aclu.org/school discipline. And this was when I was transitioning from the UCLA Civil Rights Project to ACLU. And we had this data with it was the first time nationally the government published the number of days students lost. And our analysis showed that students missed over 11 million days for suspension. Disproportionately, that fell on Black students, with Black students account for over 40%, over 4 million of those days, even though Black students are about 15% of schools. So they're almost half of suspensions, or at least the education being missed from suspensions, and not half of the student population. And that's an issue because, that's Black students being deprived of their education disproportionately. Because we always hear about this achievement gap, right? But there's actually an opportunity gap. And we cited this in our study as well, that suspensions account for about 20% of the achievement gap. Black students are in their chairs less. They have less learning opportunities. So that's where you see that. And that's where some of the issues with discipline start. And they start early with, I believe, is pre-K, right? In California, we just passed a law here that's going to hopefully get at some of those disparities that start when, the children are just 4 years old. How much can their behavior actually vary? Right? But the research shows Black boys are still being suspended almost 4 times as much as the general population when they're just 4 years old. So, how much of a monster can you be? Right? So it starts very early on, and it goes all throughout high school with students being pushed out disproportionately, students with disabilities as well.
Yeah. And so that's really interesting what you said, Amir, about that gap and the absence of opportunity, and just linking that to what Reyna said about why she is invested in this work. And it's because so many of us who come from communities of color are taught that opportunity, that that getting a education is opportunity. It is the way that you rise above, it's the way that you achieve, it's the way that you overcome systemic racism. But then come to find out, systemic racism is also holding you back from getting the one tool that everybody tells you that you need. So that's a tragic triangle. So I want to open this next question up to the whole panel, and I'm going to start with Reyna. So when we talk about, we've talked about the disparities that exist, but I want to really paint a picture for people about what kind of discipline is happening to our kids, right? So like, what are the behaviors that kids are getting disciplined for? But what I really want to hone in on is, what does that discipline look like? Like, what are the methods that school districts are using to discipline kids? And so we'll start with Reyna, and then we'll kind of do a round robin after that.
Well, I know that looks different in every state, but I think one thing that I just wanted to highlight during COVID specifically is that it's not, sometimes in Washington, at least what we're seeing from our clients, is that it sometimes doesn't look like formal discipline. Sometimes it just looks like teachers asking for kids to take a timeout, or it's in the treatment of children and how they just withdraw from school. And they withdraw from the screens if they're still in a virtual learning space. And so I don't really want to speak to, I think probably some of our attorneys, which you could please feel free to connect with me to learn more about specific trends in Washington. I don't want to speak to that, but I just wanted to highlight that there's a lot of discipline happening that's not being captured because it's not formalized and it's not being tracked.
Right. And then it reveals itself in other ways through the way that young people interact with other adults and with the world. And then it's really hard to actually track that. No, that's a super good point.
And I think that parents, because of the virtual learning environment during COVID, they're able to see that more clearly in their face, like hearing how teachers are interacting with their students directly. And so that's a trend that we're seeing, and that parents that we are trying to create systemic and policy change with are raising to us is just the mere treatment of their children and the tone with which they're spoken, and how many times they are or not getting called on during class. So while it's not formal, it's still impacting education and leading to withdrawal from education.
Hugely impactful. And I imagine that the process of implicit bias that we'll talk about a little later on is also at play here. So we definitely are going to come back to this. Chris, what do you think?
I would like to add, if I can jump in, I would like to add that, well, one of the problems that we now know exists is undocumented discipline. So there are many situations in which kids are just sent home, but it's not recorded as an out-of-school suspension. And we now know that that is a problem in a bunch of different school districts where just kids are sent home, right? And told, don't come back for 2 days, et cetera. But they don't get a letter saying that they're formally suspended. They aren't made aware of any kind of due process rights they may have, which of course varies from state to state. And so there are this problem of informal suspensions as well. The other thing that I would highlight is it's not just out of school suspensions. And I think Amir is absolutely on point in calling attention to lost days of instruction in the classroom due to out of school suspensions. When you talk about disparities, one of the things that you find is that there's a certain group of kids who tend to be suspended more than once. So it's not just one incident and it goes. And we find, lo and behold, that Black students are more likely to be suspended more than once than any other group. So more than one time in the course of a school year. So you're talking about all kinds of punishment. When we think about discipline, we often think about anything from detention to in-school to out-of-school suspension to arrest. But there is also the issue of police issuing students citations, summary citations, tickets, which actually have legal consequences in most states, actually outside of the juvenile justice system. So tickets in adult courts, at least in Pennsylvania. So discipline runs a sort of broad spectrum and it includes a lot of things.
Yeah, and so I'd really like to talk about the citation issue, Harold, that you mentioned when we get to the cops and schools part, because that's also fascinating. And I think an area that we don't always think about in terms of the civil consequences for young people with their interaction with police. Chris, do you have things you want to add?
Well, one of the things that we talked about, like in just planning for what we wanted to share with the audience, was thinking about putting a face, right? Putting a narrative on exactly what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. And for folks who haven't had a chance to read The Rage of Innocence, I open the book and close the book with a story about a kid I call Eric, who indeed was disciplined at school. And so, you know, to really give it a face and to talk about this incredible range of discipline that Reyna and Harold both have talked about. So Eric was a 13-year-old boy who on a Saturday night was watching a movie and he saw someone with a Molotov cocktail. In his 13-year-old brain, he thought that looked cool, right? And he wanted to make something that looked like that. He doesn't look it up. He doesn't research it. He just goes into the kitchen. He grabs a glass bottle and he begins to pour all kinds of liquids in that bottle. He tapes it up and he puts a piece of toilet paper in the bottle, right? Running from the inside to the outside. And we as adults know, and so did he, right? That this toilet paper is going to burn out before it even reaches the cap. But he closes up the cap. He plays with it for a little while. He forgets all about it and he puts it in his book bag. And here's where school comes into play. Monday morning, that was a Saturday night. Monday morning, it's still in his book bag. He forgets all about it. He puts his book bag through the metal detector and a school resource officer sees it and says to him, "What is this?" He immediately says, "Oh, that is nothing. You can throw it away." Eric goes on to class, right? And little does he know, this is the beginning of a 9-month ordeal. And here's what's so incredibly important about this story. One, the fact that he's criminalized for just normal adolescent behavior, being creative, being thoughtful, being experimenting. And let me really be clear, sometime later, some months after I represented Eric, I go to Connecticut and I tell this story in a room full of advocates. A woman came up to me afterwards, a white woman, and she said to me, "My son did the same thing. He made a Molotov cocktail." You all can guess what happened to him. Guess what? He got placed in advanced science classes, right? My kid gets, what is the discipline that my kid gets? He gets arrested in school, marched out in front of everyone. And so talking about the harms, right? The informal harms of police officers showing you, pulling you out of class, embarrassing you, the trauma of that. But not only does he get arrested, he also gets expelled from school. And here's another one of those informal, we fought to get him back in school, fought the expulsion, but when they bring him back, they exclude him from all of his extracurricular classes, extracurricular activity. And he was a huge drama participant, loved drama club, and was prohibited from participating in that. So we just really wanted to put a face on what this looks like and what the entire range. And so the only other thing I'll add about this informal type of discipline is especially for girls and Black girls and Latino girls who come to school and get accused of violating the dress code. And those informal disciplines include things like being sent home to change clothes, being forced to wear an oversized sweatshirt to cover up their clothes, all of these things that are embarrassing and that increase the likelihood that the child won't come back.
Yeah, and just adding to that, Chris, when you add in the dynamic of hair, right?
Yes.
Like we've seen countless stories about young Black girls and boys who, you know, either have like extensions or have locks or have, you know, something that is typically attached to the Black community being told to take it out or being asked to cut it out right there and then, right? That, you know, those things are embarrassing and they're counter to a cultural norm that those students have.
That's right.
Definitely.
And they feel the disparity, right? Like we think about
they feel the
girls
unfairness of it, right?
That's
yes.
right. That's
yes.
right. They often, when you read those stories about the young folks, girls and boys who have had to adjust their hair, they talk about, but my classmate, my white classmate, or my classmates at schools down the road didn't have to do that. And so we really have to recognize that our kids are aware of the differential treatment.
Yeah. Now, I see that there's a great conversation happening in the chat about corporal punishment. And so like I see that Harold as well as Amir have put some information in there. Amir, I just want to turn to you because that might not be something that youth defenders have really thought about. Like there are approximately 19 states that are still permitting it. I live in a state that like permits it, but doesn't, but lets counties choose. And I know one particular county says it doesn't do it, but I know for a fact they do it. So, the number may be even bigger, right? So I just want to like invite you to share your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I put in the chat a report we published at UCLA on corporal punishment, and we found that school year, over 100,000 children went to school and were abused, right, by their educators. If I hit any of you with, a 2-foot long piece of wood, it's aggravated assault and battery, because that constitutes a weapon. However, in many states, children, educators are using violence to enforce it. And someone did call out that some districts are going back. In Missouri, just last week, a district decided to opt in to corporal punishment, saying that because they don't want to suspend students. So it's like, we don't want to take you out of class, we'll take it out on your, And so they're paddling kids. And we have to say that's violence, right? The school to prison pipeline talks about, schools making students more likely to end up in prison. When you use violence on someone, that makes them more aggressive as well. So, our youth defenders, if you have a client who's been corporally punished, that's something that will contribute to their, tendency to be more violent in the future. And just remember, this is the state, this is the government, tax dollars funding this violence on children.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
I would add about corporal punishment that from the data, we also know that in places where it's practiced, you see, alas, the same kind of racial disproportionality impacting Black students and students with disabilities that you see in other areas of school discipline. So it's not a cross-section of kids being equally punished by being spanked. There is the same kind of disproportionality there by race and disability that you see in other areas of discipline.
Yeah. Okay, so this is fascinating, and we could continue to delve into this, but I also want to move into looking at the behavior of young people that's like a part of this process. And so we oftentimes say normal adolescent behavior. Is probably better to say typical, right? And so like we all know that young people are different. Like, like our society has intentionally chosen to treat adolescents as different. We know that their brains aren't fully developed. We know that the part of the brain that controls like impulse control and the ability to, accurately assess future risk is just not fully there yet. And then also, as Harold said, like school is supposed to be this place of hope. It's supposed to be this place where you like learn how to be a citizen, how you learn how to manage conflict. It's supposed to be this like nurturing space. And so as a result, kids should have the freedom and space to be able to make mistakes and be corrected in a nurturing, caring way, right? But we're not seeing that. We're seeing lots of students being punished disproportionately for typical adolescent misbehavior. So I want to turn to Chris, because Chris, in the book, you paint a really good example and picture of this very dynamic that I'm talking about. Like I feel like the young woman, the girl rather, that you talk about in this book, I feel like I was friends with her in middle school and high school. So can you share that story with us? We're both on mute. It's okay.
Sorry about that. I muted myself and then accidentally unmuted.
I do the same thing. Go ahead.
But look, yeah, you're talking about Charisse for sure. And Charisse was, that's what I call her in the book, a client that we represented who was treated yet again like a felon for engaging in what really is typical or normal adolescent behaviors. And Charisse was a 17-year-old girl who got into an argument with her boyfriend at school in the hallway. And during the argument, she was convinced that her boyfriend was cheating on her. And so she wanted to see his cell phone. She grabs his cell phone out of his hand and begins to walk away. As she's walking away, she's scrolling through his text messages to see if he had been communicating with anyone else. A school resource officer sees this and decides to intervene. His intervention was to arrest her. Yet again, just like Eric, arrest her in the hallway in front of her classmates, highly embarrassing. She gets held in detention overnight and charged the next day, formally prosecuted the next day for robbery, for taking the property of another by stealth and violence. I mean, really, it's just an appalling sort of criminalization of everything you just talked about, Ebony, how teenagers are impulsive, reactive, emotional, they're fairness fanatics, right? She's not gonna, she cares what her friends think. She's not gonna be punked by her boyfriend in front of everybody. And the officer, instead of intervening, first of all, we don't need an officer to intervene, right? Instead of some adult, intervening in that moment, like you would for your own kids or for a teenager, she gets arrested for that. And so you're absolutely right. It's just a perfect example of this criminalization of typical, normal, what we expect developmentally from children at that age.
Yeah. And I think that there are some people who will hear a story like that and think that it's an outlier, will think that, oh, well, that was just that one time that happened. But in Cops and No Counselors, Amir and Harold, you all have a whole appendix of these types of things. Can one of you, just like chat with us about like about the various examples?
Sure. So in the report, it's a chart that has over 25 different behaviors and examples, and importantly, citations, right? So you can see the news article to see children arrested for bringing a whoopee cushion to school, for dress code violations and different things. Throwing Skittles, which, Ebony, one of our colleagues at SPLC, right? I didn't believe that case, but what happened in New Orleans, like throwing Skittles, that's assault and battery. One student I represented through a stapler was charged with assault and battery. And that's the issue, as Chris described, when a law enforcement is there and they see typical adolescent behavior, they're looking at it through a lens of criminalization. Hyper-criminalization. But some of those behaviors, literally in no other environment would they be criminal except in the school, right? And we have this youth control complex with adultism where we impose different standards on children that we don't even have on ourselves. Like, I know a lot of districts that have more strict attendance policies with the students than they have with teachers, right? They will call home and criminalize students for being truant when teachers, if they miss 5 days, they're not responded to the same way. So just a lot of adolescent behaviors are seen through a criminal lens, but even just some really uncommon, but also unthreatening things, like literally my hair, right? My red hair, which Ebony, when I was working under you, you had red hair, right? Which inspired me to get the red hair where you used to, but yeah. That this literally breaks the dress code only in schools. No other setting would they tell you that your hair color is disrupting anything.
Yeah. And so I want to bring in Reyna, just to ask Reyna from like someone who's working closely with community members and youth. Do you have a perspective that you think would be helpful here?
Yeah, I think one thing that I wanted to surface as part of the school to prison pipeline that I'm not sure is always talked about, that we're kind of looking at, is protection orders. So like the fact that, there's these normal altercations like that we would expect any young people like going through life to have amongst themselves in the school context. And then because, and sometimes that rises to the level of bullying and harassment, right? And then because they're not good systems, restorative or transformative healing and conflict resolution practices set up within schools, then families and students are looking to other mechanisms like protection orders, which then excludes the other person from their education and from their school. So I just wanted to call that out as this, it's not a cop coming in and arresting, but it's still a part of like the legal system that is helping to exclude youth from school. So that's one thing, you know, that we're starting to look at with a youth advisory board that we recently convened to advise our policy and litigation strategies, is how do we better address harassment and bullying within schools so that there's an alternative to getting legal systems involved.
Right. That's wonderful, Reyna, because again, I thought we made a decision as a society that we wanted to treat kids a certain kind of way, but I think it's only certain types of kids, like certain colors of kids, that we want to treat that way. And I think that's a good segue. Well, before I do that, I just want to open up the chat here to ask any of the youth defenders who are on the panel, if you could just put in the chat, if you have any examples like what Amir and Harold and Chris and Reyna were talking about, these things that are really typical adolescent misbehavior that are being criminalized. If you want to drop that in the chat so we can maybe see some ideas of what's happening in other places and other jurisdictions.
I would like to add a point on this. And so I think it's important to understand that these types of punishments are not things that just happen as a result of sort of individual behaviors by angry adults in particular school situations. In fact, the school codes have been rewritten so as to permit and encourage a broader use of this kind of discipline. And so, you know, and school districts have gone both ways on this. There was a wave of about 2 decades where increasingly school codes were written in a way that tied them to some extent to criminal codes. And so the definition of disorderly conduct in a school code was literally tied to, there might even be a citation to disorderly conduct in the criminal code. And so, you know, that's one of the things that happen so as to permit and encourage kids to be excluded from school as a form of punishment. And there's been quite a battle over what's in school codes, the school codes of conduct, partly because of that. And school districts have gone in different directions. Some have maintained this sort of writing of codes in a way that makes everything sound like it's a potential criminal violation. Yeah. Others have stepped back from that, at least when it comes to certain types of infractions. But that's an ongoing struggle. You'll find in the spring and the summer of every year, a school board rewrites or approves amendments to its code of conduct. And that's the kind of thing that we need to as advocates, struggle around what ends up in the code of conduct. But I can tell you that there was a period of time for about 2 decades where increasingly codes of conduct, the sections on discipline, would resemble like a table of maximum punishments in the justice system.
Yeah, and that pairs up, I think, with the move towards making schools look carceral, right? And so we're obviously going to talk about cops here in a little bit and all the trappings that come with cops. But I have noticed that also, Harold, looking at student codes of conduct and how it talks about infractions and how it's written in like a 3 strikes and you're out kind of thing. Like it very much mirrors the system of mass incarceration that is present in the adult system. I think that is like exactly on and not something that a lot of us have been thinking about.
And I would just add one thing. You know, this is even true of infractions that are considered minor, sort of level 1 infractions. They're also written that way, just things that might be considered disorderly conduct. They're also written that way in the school code. So the idea is to sort of and this is the work of bad lawyers, in part advising school districts on how to write codes of conduct so as to permit kids to be disciplined in a certain way, should educators choose to do that.
Yeah. And I would add to that, building on that. I mean, and so the mirror of that is criminal codes that are written to make school behavior crimes. So like the states that have disturbing schools as a criminal violation in the criminal code. So shout out to our folks in South Carolina, the advocates in South Carolina who pushed back and got, the school disturbing schools statute amended to prohibit that kind of thing. But that's sort of the mirror image of what, Harold is talking about.
Yeah, and it's all this process of making these school rules as well as these statutes as broad as possible so that people have discretion, so that school officials have the discretion to funnel kids in if they need to and if they want to. In the chat, we had like some really good examples. We had an example of a kid being charged with assault for throwing a water bottle into a trash can like a basketball. Lots of school fights, which are like pretty normal. So a kid caused a small degree of bodily harm by throwing a snowball too harshly at a fellow student. Frightened speech being misconstrued as aggressive speech, a young person questioning a adult as resisting. So like, I mean, we all know that any type of like questioning is quickly construed as being aggressive.
Actually, the category that's widely misused is terroristic threats. I mean,
yes.
Which might be a real thing, but often when it's applied in a school code, a terroristic threat is usually something where a kid is arguing with an administrator because the kid is angry about something the administrator did or thinks they're being treated fairly, or saying, I'm going to bring my daddy, my mommy here into school to deal with you, and a kid will be suspended for making, quote, terroristic threats.
Yeah. You know, Harold, I think it's worth digging in there for just a second, like thinking about the like emotional nature of young people, frankly, but then like of young people, right? And how when they perceive something as being unfair, the emotions that they feel on the inside, they're going to let out, right? And then they're going to say, I'm going to get my mom. Like right now, I have an 8-year-old, and I promise you, he thinks his dad can beat anybody's ass. He really, really does. And he will tell anybody that his dad will come on them, right? And so it's just the adults pretending like the emotional nature of young people doesn't exist. And again, it's some young people. And so I actually want to delve into this because somebody early on put in the chat, they asked for grace and just asked, is it just that these teachers and school officials are just plain on racist? Like, is it just that there's like people are racist? And I saw you come off, Chris. Go ahead. Oh, no, that was an accident. Okay.
Oh, no, but I mean, I absolutely can address this. This is absolutely, but yeah.
Okay.
We all just get excited about this. Is so true.
Okay. Well, first, I just want to ask Harold if he can talk a little bit about what accounts for the racial disparities that we see.
Well, I think it's a lot of different things. I mean, one is clearly bias. I mean, people talk a lot about implicit bias, but a lot of the bias is really explicit. So it's implicit and explicit bias. Another is just a notion that somehow disciplining young people in a tough way is good for them. I know it's an old-fashioned attitude, which unfortunately seems to not have gone away. And then it's still pretty clear that two kids can do essentially the same thing and be treated quite differently. This has actually been studied in some detail. There's a study in Louisiana that looks at, among other things, how kids are treated by race when they're involved in the same fight. And as it turns out, the Black kid tends to be suspended for more days. We actually see this even at the earliest stage in the process, that is referrals to the front office. In other words, where a kid is removed from class and said, go to the front office. And as it turns out, according to some of the studies that have been conducted, that Black students tend to be referred for things that are sort of subjective in nature, or like loitering and things like that, whereas white kids tend to be referred more for things that are objectively measured, such as smoking. So we even see it at that level where there's some, and of course, there are the eye tracking surveys of adults who work with young kids out of Yale Child Study Center, and you see that. And so there are a lot of different factors involved in this. And when you have institutions from the sort of outside criminal justice system in schools, you're adding essentially some of the same elements that we see on the streets into the school community. So it's an issue across the board. It also is a question of resources and what types of resources exist in schools. And, as it turns out that in certain schools, kids are seen as valuable and valued in a certain kind of way. And so they're more prone to go to schools with adult resources that are supportive in nature versus not. And so this whole issue that we look at in our report, that Amir sort of spearheaded the work on the report, where we look at not only the ratio of counselors to cops, but also social workers, school psychologists, nurses, et cetera. And as it turns out, that many of these schools where there's disproportionality in discipline are schools that are desperately understaffed with adults who could, they don't always, but who could play supportive roles in working with young people. So there's also a resource question and a focus question. And there's actually some research that shows that administrators who believe in zero tolerance and tough zero tolerance absolutist policies tend to punish Black and brown children more, regardless of the race of the administrator.
Yeah.
But that gives you something to think about as well. So there are many factors, but I do think that, looking at it historically, some of these are sort of policy decisions that are made at the school and the district level about how to work with kids. Changes in policy so as to make it easier to kick kids out of school with minimal due process. That's why suspensions are much more, and in fact, even suspensions of the same students multiple times is much more common than expulsions, because generally expulsions involve quite a bit more due process
to the district.
And so it's easier just to suspend kids over and over and over and over again.
Yeah. Reyna, can you talk, so from the context of the work that you've done, the families that you've worked with, can you talk about why you think these disparities exist and how racism plays in it?
Just the families that I work closely with their children or themselves experiencing, or families experiencing discipline, it's pretty clear that they just feel like there is a bias, they just call it what it is, which is racism, internalized oppression happening because our workforce and educators are mostly white women who they feel just aren't engaging with their youth in a way that makes them feel valued and makes them feel seen and understood. So certainly anecdotally, when I'm working and talking directly with families and hearing about their experiences, they really just do highlight that there is individual choices happening within the classrooms and at an administrator level that feels unfair, and it's based in racism, but also recognizing that there's policies that just the whole structure of the policy being around punishment as opposed to accountability that really feels good at a student level, at a family level, is not present. So they talk also about just the culture of schools being carceral and punishment based, as opposed to being around like true accountability and transforming the system so that no kids are needing to, like, kids can be held accountable, but in a loving way that's appropriate for their development, that like fosters engagement within schools, that fosters more positive relationships within schools. They really do highlight, the bias and racism of teachers and of administrators, but also like the culture that is very based in white supremacy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one of the hallmarks of white supremacy is like internal bias. Harold brought it up. Now, to be clear, he's right. There's a lot of explicit bias also, right? But Chris, in our racial justice toolkit, which, side note, Georgetown and the Gault Center partnered on a racial justice toolkit. If you are a youth defender, you should go sign up for it to get tools there. Again, it's just for our youth defenders to help in their advocacy of representing young people who are of color. But Chris, in a lot of trainings and in our racial justice toolkit, you talked about implicit racial bias and how it works. I think that's directly relevant to the question that we got about, are these teachers just good old-fashioned racist? Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So let me just say this, from this lens of grace, we all have racial bias, right? Including folks of the same race. Gets it really at what Harold was talking about here. And our racial biases, and the research shows that our racial biases cause us to be more likely to perceive or interpret a child's disabilities, a child's trauma responses, a child's sadness, and other types of emotions as angry, as violent, as aggressive, instead of what they are, trauma responses and cognitive limitations and the like. And we have summarized for you, it's on the Racial Justice Toolkit, as Ebony said, but also we will provide to everyone on this webinar who registered for the webinar in a follow-up email, a summary, a plain language summary of the research that we've been talking about here. Reba and Harold and Amir have been doing a good job of putting some of those studies in. We're going to continue. We've already summarized them for you, but we're going to make that available to you. For those of you who are watching on the YouTube, this webinar later on YouTube, we'll add it as a link to the webinar. But I think, Harold did a great job of starting us off, summarizing some of that research. But there's more, there's volumes of empirical research demonstrating that our racial biases impact the way we perceive Black children, Latino children, and other children of color. We are more likely to inaccurately perceive emotions such as sadness, depression, as anger. We are more likely to perceive Black boys as older than they actually are. And I hope everyone knows that study by Philip Atiba Goff. Everyone should know that, right? And not just perceiving Black boys as older, but significantly older on a magnitude of more than 4.5 years older than they actually are. That has a profound impact upon how a teacher perceives a child's typical or normal adolescent behavior. Similar studies have been done about Black girls being perceived as older, more mature, more knowledgeable about adult topics, less in need of protection. More generally, there's a wealth of research on how civilians, all of us, again, within the same race, are more likely to perceive innocuous or ambiguous facial expressions or behaviors by Black youth as more dangerous and threatening, while perceiving those exact facial expressions by white youth as not dangerous. Look, teenagers in a group, and that's what teenagers do. They hang out in packs. The research shows that folks are more likely to perceive teenagers in a crowd or in a group as dangerous and to give them that gang label than they are to white youth. And we could go on, but we wanted to provide that for you as a summary in writing, and we will definitely send that out to you.
Yeah. So Chris, I want to stick with you for a minute. So, the bulk of the people here are youth defenders. This is a training for everybody, but, we do our work for youth defenders because we think that the most effective way to ensure the liberty interests of children is to have strong advocates, one of those advocates being youth defenders. So I know that lots of youth defenders think that, school discipline is not my problem. It is not my issue. It happens in the school. It becomes my issue when, whatever the school discipline issue is manifests itself into a referral or a petition. But, they think if it does not, then it has nothing to do with me. And so can you talk a little bit about why it is that our community of youth defenders should actually care about what's happening with school discipline?
Absolutely. And when we think about the importance of school or the impact of school on every single stage of the juvenile legal system, we see that these school discipline hearings or the school disciplinary infractions matter a lot. Judges, probation officers, prosecutors, other court actors care a lot about school. On the front end, thinking about kids are more likely to get sent to detention at the time of arrest when they are not in school or have a disciplinary record at school. Kids are more likely to get violated during their pretrial conditions of release when they're not in school or get arrested or even just disciplined, forget arrest, get disciplined at school. They are less likely at the time of sentencing or disposition to get some form of community-based probation or diversion when they're not in school. School discipline becomes the basis for a violation of probation for kids who did get probation. Kids also get disciplinary infractions in school inside of detention facilities, right? So, it's just like triple compounding, of the situation. And so I think, to be quite frank, that the school to prison question and the school discipline work is very much part and parcel of the work that we do and we need to be doing as defenders. And I see that there's questions about solutions and to a lot of this,
Yeah, right. And so that flows into the next question that I was going to ask you is, so oftentimes youth defenders don't know that a school disciplinary hearing or school discipline issue is actually happening. However, when we do know, what is it that youth defenders can do? Like, what are the actions that we as a community can take to impact this?
Yeah, I gotta say, Ebony, I love the way you frame that question, is that sometimes we don't know. And I think the first job of a defender is to figure out how to get notice of these hearings, right? And making sure that making sure that the hearings are actually happening. This flows beautifully from everything that we've been talking about. All of these kids who get these informal disciplinary actions, go home or whatever it is, go to detention hall and no due process hearing. And that as defenders, we should be insisting that those hearings happen. And so one of the ways is thinking about how we fold these kinds of questions into our routine attorney-client conversation and our conversations with our clients' family members, telling them, hey, if anything comes up at school, talk to me. Tell me about what's going well at school, what's not going well. And certainly if you get any disciplinary action, please tell us about it so that we can work on it. And I know a lot of defenders are saying, but I don't know anything about this work. I got to say, that's then a part and parcel of us as defenders figuring out how we're going to get, even within our offices, basic fundamental training, just so we know the basics of how school discipline works. So getting a copy of our local school-based disciplinary records, those are available by FOIA or by any child who's got a parent or any child that we represent who's in the school. We can get that school-based regulations if they're not online. understanding the fundamental due process framework, constitutional framework in Gault v. Lopez, right? Figuring out what the minimum due process requirement is and showing up at the school, writing letters to the school, insisting upon those due process procedures. It's also about showing up at the school disciplinary hearings and participating actively as an advocate. And, I know a lot of this conversation is for defenders, but it's also for mentors, adult mentors, counselors, folks who are community activists who can join in those hearings and just be a voice, for that child in those hearings based on the rules. They're very rule-based type hearings, right? Yeah. Partnering with education advocates, figuring out who the education advocates are in your community, having a brown bag lunch where you bring them in, not only for training, but to see if they can partner with you around some of these hearings. Things like that, I think, is the way to go. And partnering with local law school clinics who might be interested in this, social workers who could help us with these. So those are just some ideas to get us started.
Yeah, and I would just add to that on that last point. Law students can play an important role. I mean, obviously they need to be trained and supervised in that, but we have had some good experiences in Philadelphia, for example, with law students volunteering and who are trained to help parents and kids in school disciplinary hearings and settings. So that's another pool of talent. But generally, the so-called juvenile justice system is really in a separate world from the education system, and folks who work in the education system don't know much about what happens in the so-called justice system, and vice versa. So understanding what these linkages are and procedurally, et cetera, is an important piece of it from both sides.
Yeah. And the commonality, Harold, between those two systems are youth and families. And so with that in mind, I want to turn to Reyna, thinking about not just youth defenders in terms of like the actually direct representation, but also in like reform and policy changes and whatnot. What do you see as the role of youth defenders in aiding youth and families in changing the way that the school to prison pipeline, eliminating rather the school to prison pipeline?
Yeah, the way that and so my organization, we're not youth defenders, but we provide civil legal aid, but we partner with youth defenders oftentimes to keep youth in schools. But I think our role as attorneys generally, I've been thinking a lot about this a lot and learning a lot about it as I've been more and more exposed and looking more into movement lawyering, is that we should be a tool, right? I think TeamChild, I give a lot of credit to our Undoing Institutional Racism training through the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. But we've come to understand that our role really needs to be to elevate the experience, expertise, and voice of the youth that we represent and their families and their communities. So I think it's our role as people with relative privilege in the legal field to leverage our access, tools, resources, so that leadership can really be taken by those communities who are directly impacted. And so for us, that's manifested in a couple different ways. One thing is just internally, we include youth, our like previous clients or current clients and other community partners in our hiring processes who gets to represent youth in an attorney-client relationship. We've also, as I mentioned, built a youth advisory board. So youth who have myriad of different experiences and identities informing our policy and litigation work. So I think it is really about trying to leverage ourselves and see ourselves as following the direction of youth and communities. And that's hard, I think, for a lot of us. And I noticed it was hard for a lot of our attorneys who have, privileged identities, our white attorneys or attorneys who came like maybe generations before me, who consider ourselves as experts, and we're experts of something, right? But I think we run the risk of being very paternalistic and top down and kind of tokenizing our clients and their communities in this work. And so that's just another layer of oppression that we don't want to replicate in trying to accomplish reform together.
You know, Reyna, I want to sit on that point that you just made about, you know, about many lawyers, not just youth defenders, but like lawyers or you know, people who come from privileged identities. And I'll add like having a certain education level, having a certain you know, like class level, and how we tend to, you know, think that we are the experts, like think that we are the experts, and we don't listen to the voices of families and youth. And so I've known Amir for a long time. I know he's itching to talk right now. I know that like there's something that he definitely wants to say on the subject. So Amir, do you have thoughts?
No, absolutely. And at ACLU of Southern California, where I'm at right now, we started our Youth Liberty Squad a few years ago. And I actually, I had to give an ultimatum saying if we're not giving support to organize and coordinate with youth so they can be their voice, that I would leave the organization. Because with other issue areas, you know, with LGBTQ+, you had LGBTQ+ people speaking on behalf. With immigrants' rights, they had immigrants speaking, you know, in every other area. In women's rights, you know, they had women. But when it came to education, it was just us advocates speaking on behalf of children. And that's part of adultism that we say, right? So we actually just here in Los Angeles, you know, one of the largest school districts in the country, our Youth Liberty Squad fought and passed a resolution and now got funding for arts education so that arts is funded more than police. And they kept calling the district out for spending more money on police than arts. And now the district added another $20 million to arts education because they were embarrassed about that, but also because it was students telling them like, look, I'm embarrassed to say I go to a school that looks like this or that does this. So we definitely have to step back from our own, you know, education and different things, because I still remember myself when, you know, I was a juvenile, and I was arrested and given a public defender. And it was an older white guy who, you know, was really good at listening actually. And he pulled out different things about my school and education, but he was also the first person to actually be in my corner on that issue. Yeah. And I remember, you know, parents, different people were all feeling some type of way, but my defender was the only one actually in my corner wanting to hear my story. So that's just really important. But just know our children, our youth are advocates as well. So, and I know legally, right, sometimes they can't even speak on their behalf before they're 12 years old or different things. But just try to empower youth as much as possible to speak for themselves.
Yeah.
So I would just point out that with the corporal punishment issue we talked about earlier today, I posted some things in the chat about the incident and the policy change in a Missouri school district, but I also posted an article about young people organizing against that. And so the young people in that school, the high school seniors, are organizing to challenge the sort of reinstatement of corporal punishment in that school. And so, you know, that's something to highlight as well. The young people do speak up. And part of the issue with young people speaking up is that sometimes what happens is that, you know, it's not that a young person broke a rule or anything like that. It's just speaking up makes them targets. So we do have to work with young people to help protect their rights to speak up. That's a piece of this as well.
Yeah. So in our session, I think it's next month on contempt of cop, we're actually going to be talking about how like this idea of defiance by young people is actually civil disobedience, and how this behavior is criminalized, but it's their form of activism that is a part of a legacy of civil rights in this country, like looking far as back as like the Children's March and, you know, during the 1960s in Birmingham. I also just like have to point out a couple of things. Amir, what you were saying about like being willing to quit if they did not get a youth counsel. That is an example of allyship, right? Like that is an example of the view that we as youth defenders and as people sitting in privilege need to have. Let us use our privilege in order to uplift other people who have a voice, who need to express their voice. And then also we as youth defenders are positioned in that we are one of the few adults who have to listen to the express interests of our clients, like what they say goes, right? And so following the lead of youth and families is not as foreign to us as we may think it is. Chris, I just want to like very quickly hit on this because I know there are lots of youth defenders who are saying, I'd love to do this work, but I don't have the time to do this. What advice do you have for them?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard this so many times, and I think when I talk to defenders about how to make this even possible, I think they really feel overwhelmed with their own caseload. And so I think a huge piece of it is getting supervisors invested and interested in this work such that they will lobby for, advocate for more resources to actually hire, I love this, youth advocates, first of all, to maybe hire some youth advocates on staff in the office around some of the school discipline issues, but also to hire an education advocate within the office, right? Or to raise money to increase the number of defenders so that they have lower caseloads so that they each can advocate more directly on behalf of their clients in the school context. So that's one thing is getting buy-in from the administration of the public defender office. Also, for those folks who aren't in public defender offices, it's exactly what Harold and I talked about earlier, figuring out who in your local community is already doing this work. And whether that be local law schools, is there an education project at your local ACLU? Like, is there somebody already doing the work? Invite them. You see all these folks on the call. Folks are interested and willing to come and meet with you to brainstorm in your local community how you might do it. I see Mark must be from California, Debug. Right? Like there's different organizations across the country who can help with that. I hate to volunteer Harold, but Harold is the national chair of the school discipline committee, for the ACLU national. So he can give you some ideas, but the idea is getting at the table with folks who know how to do this and brainstorm about how to make it easier for us as defenders to do the work, and how to empower young people and their families, to be able to be advocates for themselves in these hearings.
I'm happy to make suggestions or to refer people to activist groups. I mean, there are groups all around the country that are working on these issues. Not everywhere, but they're pretty broadly spread out around the country that are working on some aspect of this issue of unfair discipline. And this may come as a surprise to people. I am not a lawyer here, but I work collaboratively with lawyers, with administrators, with students, with parents. My kids went to public school K to 12. So I've always been invested in schools and was active as a parent. But I'm happy to share any kind of ideas or contacts that I may have. But I work across all of those lines, and I'm not the only person who does that.
Thank you, Harold. So we're like an hour and 15 in, and we haven't even got to cops, but we're going to go to cops now. Okay. Like we could obviously talk about all of this for hours and hours and hours. So, I read The Rage of Innocence, and when I got to the cops in schools part, I was really shocked to find out about the true origin of how cops got into schools. And so we at the Gault Center and at Georgetown are really invested in really exploring the contours and layers of structural racism and how it impacts young people. And so it really requires, to be able to fight racism right now, that we also be looking back at where we've come from. And there's been this narrative established and built about how cops got into schools that I truly believed in until literally a year ago. So I want to turn to Chris to have you just talk about the historical roots of police in schools and just talk to us about how it evolved.
Yeah, like you, Ebony, I mean, doing this work for a long time, and I bought into the often repeated narrative that we have police in schools today because of the mass shooting in Columbine. But when I began to do research for the Rage of Innocence, I realized something that I feel like I should have known, which was that the first police in schools appeared in the 1930s in Indianapolis, in response to the earliest even inkling of a conversation about the possibility of integrating school systems. And so that was the first. And then after that, we see that police in schools increased exponentially in the civil rights era, under the guise of providing a safe passage for children who were indeed going to integrate schools after Brown versus Board of Education. But we know from the iconic photographs and from the historical record that far too often police became an impediment to meaningful integration of schools. But then if we fast forward to 1991, the National Association of School Resource Officers is founded in 1991. 8 years before the shooting in Columbine. That means that there were enough police in schools as a result of that historical trajectory to have an entire association with conferences and mission statements and training materials. That's in 91. Fast forward just a little bit to the mid 1990s, we're talking 94, 95, when the federal Cops in Schools framework is created. That's the federal framework that allowed the federal government to funnel money into state and local school systems that would agree to what? Impose or input police in schools. Again, this is before Columbine. And then in 1999, Columbine does indeed happen. And thereafter, we see periodic increases for police in schools. But where do those police officers get sent? They get sent to schools with a predominantly Black and Brown presence, right? And so we have more police in schools means more arrest in schools. More arrest in schools means more arrest of Black and Brown students. And I think it's just absolutely, if we think about that historical trajectory and what we know about structural racism, the historical record really demonstrates that school resource officers were intended to, or part and parcel of this greater effort to control Black and Brown students in this legacy of systemic racism. And so it's a great question, Ebony, and a really important foundation for this conversation.
And fascinating, right? I mean, like, I think that everybody who advocates against the school to prison pipeline does not believe that SROs were put into schools to protect students from a mass shooting, right? Like everyone, but that there was just like this very cool, like this, like almost very obvious line, right? Like this very obvious strain of racism, like this continuation of mass incarceration that is just like very clear. It's like absolutely fascinating. And so the consequence of that, of the history that you just said, is that typically there is a disproportionate amount of cops in majority Black and Latino schools compared to white schools. And so I want to invite the whole panel to just give your thoughts on that dynamic of how there tends to be a larger police presence in Black schools or Latino schools compared to white schools. And so like whoever wants to come up first.
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing I would add is that what's changed about all of this in the last 25 or 30 years is that police are in schools on a regular or full-time basis, instead of just being called in response to emergencies or, you know, serious criminal acts or allegations of that. That's the thing that has actually changed the most. And so, you know, with the data, you can see that reflected in the number of police in schools, where police are in schools 2 or more days a week. And so it's the sort of embedding of police in schools that is the thing that is the most significant. I mean, police have been around schools for a long time, but you would typically see a police officer standing on the corner at the beginning of the day or in a lot, beginning of the day, end of the day, sometimes serving as crossing guards, things like that. But it's the embedding of police in schools as almost a part of the school staff, where the school hallway becomes the police officer's beat. That is the thing that has changed in schools over a period of time. And I think Chris is also correct in pointing out that these things are not always tied to, they're often not tied to school shootings. So back in 2005, for example, the Justice Department funded a national study where they interviewed principals of schools on the one hand, and heads of law enforcement agencies that provide police to schools, outside law enforcement agencies that provide police officers to schools. And one of the questions they were asked is, what led to the start of a school resource officer program in your school? And exactly 4% of principals and 4% of heads of law enforcement said that it was an uptick in the programs were started in response to an uptick in serious misconduct in those schools. Well, what's the other 96%? So it turns out that something in the 30% is the availability of public funding and grant funding. And an equivalent thing would be public perceptions about safety or lack of safety, but not necessarily an increase in the number of serious misconduct incidents. And so what tends to happen is after every school shooting, there's a there's a kind of opportunistic dynamic by the proponents of law enforcement and the trade associations such as NASLO that essentially gets legislatures, both state and federal, to place a lot more money into that. But it's not always tied to the actual level of misconduct or crime. And if you look at the historical patterns with regard to arrest rates, the interesting thing is that arrest rates started going up in schools when juvenile crime went down. And so the number of police went up schools when juvenile crime started going down, going back a couple of decades. And so there's a kind of a mismatch between that. And as I'm sure many of you know, there's been a great emphasis over the last 10 or 12 years on sort of a press from the public and sometimes from government institutions to reform school discipline so as to reduce unnecessary out-of-school suspensions. That's worked in some places, not in others. The interesting thing, though, is that when you look at the data on policing arrangements and arrests during a period of time in which nationwide, say out-of-school suspensions, which are already way too high, kind of leveled off in terms of the national data, arrests went up and referrals to law enforcement went up. So the same US Department of Education slide deck that I referred to at the beginning of this session from June of last year shows that although out-of-school suspensions leveled out and maybe even declined in terms of the nationwide data from 96,000 publicly funded schools, arrests went up in a 2-year period of time, 5%. Referrals to law enforcement went up 12%. And that is in a 2-year period of time, according to federal education data that is submitted by school districts from around the country. And so the growing presence has meant a growing rate of arrests. I mean, that is clearly so, and it's often not tied to what is going on in that school itself. There is also this opportunistic dynamic that after every school shooting, schools get flooded with police, independently of whether police make a difference or not. And we actually know from the data as well as from the incidents that having police in schools does not result in fewer school shootings or even fewer casualties.
Right. Okay. And so I know I asked Amir and Reyna to answer this question also, but I want to add something to it if you all don't mind. So like we're talking about like a quantitative amount, right? But there's also a qualitative experience too. So you know, I've done work in Birmingham City Schools with 99% Black. 85% of the students are on free and reduced lunch. The SROs there, like Harold said, were working a beat, basically. Like they were a part of the school staff. They were used to effectuate school discipline that resulted in arrests. The neighboring school district, Jefferson County Public Schools, where my husband actually works, the SRO that's there, like Harold said, directs traffic. Hangs out in the back of the office. He works the football games and the basketball games, mainly to walk whoever worked the concession stand to, you know, safely with the, you know, money because it's open to the public. So the experiences of police in schools are the way that children in majority Black schools experience police in schools is far different than more integrated schools, right? That's, you know, that's been my experience. So Reyna and then Amir, I just wanted to insert that into my question, my original question, and just ask you for your thoughts on it.
I guess I'll just add something that hasn't been, which is that while there's the association for SROs, there's what I found is that there's just not consistency like you're speaking to in the training that's required of SROs and like procedures that's required of SROs. And so that's very concerning because that leaves it up to a lot of racism and bias. And like we see how police officers are, or school resource officers, not only are in schools, but I've heard anecdotally follow youth once they leave the school, you know, the school property into the community. So then it just becomes a site, like depending on what school you go to, it just becomes a site where you're going to be followed not only from school, but into your community and then potentially punished for, you know, typical youth behavior out in community too. So that's just a piece that I'll mention.
Thank you, Reyna.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, but before I go into the qualitative, I do want to share one quantitative, very disturbing thing that came out of the report that Harold and I did, that, you know, out of about 50 or so million students nationwide, about 14 million of them, you know, so upwards almost 30% of students are in schools that have a police officer, have a cop, but no either counselor, nurse, social worker, or school psychologist, you know, right. So the way the school is set up, right, by default, is not to support and students. And I have two stories that I can share. And they're also mentioned in this report that I just dropped in a link that we published last year that looked at California arrests using both federal and state and even local district data. One student here in Los Angeles, actually, she was a senior in high school, you know, doing college prep, doing all of that stuff, busy day, didn't eat as much, and she passed out at school. She fainted. The school didn't have a nurse. She was awakened by a police officer who, instead of, one, he's not even trained to administer health support or anything like that, but instead he's asking her, are you on drugs, and criminalizing her and different things. And then after that, targeted her, would see her drinking Starbucks and ask her what's in the cup and different things. So he's trained the way police are trained, or at least he's responding the way law enforcement responds. We had another student in Riverside County where we sued because of this program, but the student was at a school that didn't have social workers. And Riverside has like several times as many police than social workers in their school. And this student was literally grieving, lost 2 family members in a single year. And you can see the referral that they were given. And this is in the report that I just shared. This is like the actual referral, and it said crime or issue, and it said grieving. And they were referred to probation, referred to law enforcement. The school didn't have a social worker to actually support the grief and mourning of the student, right? So those are what the stories look like, but millions of students are in these types of schools. You know, almost 1 out of every 3 students are in a school that's literally set up to not meet their success. And it's unfortunate that with even this new administration, because that number, that 14 million number was actually tweeted out by Vice President Kamala Harris. I was so proud that she tweeted out our research when she was running for president, and she said that it was, you know, disturbing. But yet this administration has been putting forth more funds to actually exacerbate the problem, and we're seeing it grow. So we're still seeing districts lay off counselors, lay off other staff while fighting to keep their school police officers, and it's really unfortunate.
Yeah.
So one of the things I'd like to explore for just a minute is you will see in school district sort of wishful thinking policy statements and statements made by public officials, and even statements made by National Association of School Resource Officers, the Trade Association of School Police, a statement that police should not be involved in school discipline. They're only there to address serious crime and to be mentors, et cetera. As it turns out, you know, that kind of argument is made, that kind of statement is made as a rationale for increasing the number of police in schools. And in fact, it has not resulted, even when it's in a code of conduct, in police being less involved in ordinary school discipline.
Right.
That's the thing to understand. That part of the reason that folks are pushing more for police-free schools is that efforts to reform policing, to keep police out of certain matters, have failed.
Yes.
Have failed. You know, but yet this line about discipline, not being involved in discipline, is still being sold. And there's a growing amount, there's a small amount of research, but a growing amount of research on this question. What does it mean for police to be involved in discipline? How are they involved in discipline? One piece of it is based on interviews with school police officers about how they see their role. And as it turns out, in majority Black schools, police officers tend to see themselves as, tend to see the threat as coming, the threat that they must be prepared to address as coming from the students themselves. In more racially mixed schools and in majority white schools, the officers who work there report seeing their role as protecting those kids from an unauthorized person coming in the building from the outside. So this is how police officers see their role. And the other thing is that when police are there on a full-time basis and when they're treated like school staff, they intervene and are encouraged by educators or called by educators to intervene in everyday school matters, such as cell phone violations and the sort. And there are no districts I know of that have firm rules that prohibit that, as opposed to wishful thinking general statements of principle on this point. There are no school districts I know of that say that police officers are not allowed to do X, Y, and Z with some level of specificity. And that's the situation that you have in schools. So when police are embedded in schools, they're essentially a part of school staff, whether they are officially paid for by the district or not. And the other implication of all of this is that in too many places, police officers working in schools have unlawful access to student records in violation of FERPA, which is a big issue that I work on.
Yeah, right. And so inserting police officers into school staff is going to contribute to this dynamic that we talked about changing schools into carceral settings, right? And so that's how you get this idea of like codes of conduct being written more like criminal statutes. Go ahead, Harold.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing from the perspective of defenders that you need to think about is Fourth and Fifth Amendment issues in schools. And the news is not good. I mean, the law is very different in different jurisdictions. The case law in this is very different. But when can police officers participate in a search and what can they do with the fruit of that search? That's something where we really need a lot more kind of help and legal support on. But where that issue has been litigated, the results are very mixed in different jurisdictions.
Right.
The other thing is that when a police officer standing in a hall or interacting with a student is involved in a conversation with a student, what can they do with information that they claim the student shared with them? Is that an interrogation or not? These are some real, like, serious, Defender 101 issues that really need to be sorted out. and sort it out both in advocacy, but also to get school districts to adopt formal policies. Whether police officers are stationed in schools or not, if they're coming in the schools, there needs to be a set of rules when it comes to kids' constitutional rights.
Yeah.
The protection of them.
And literally as we speak, one of our policy councils, Katrina Goodjoint, is working tirelessly on a publication that's going to address exactly that, like searches, seizures, and interrogations in schools as a guide for youth defenders. And so our plan is to get that out in the next couple of months. And so I think you're exactly right, that kind of guidance, even though that the news isn't good, we have to give youth defenders a fighting chance to be able to, really push this, because the more that we argue these arguments, the more that we make it mainstream and normal within courts that we're challenging these things, the better off we are. So I want to hit on, before we turn to solutions, I just really want to make sure that we hit on the impact of how police being embedded in schools, the changes to the student code of conduct, how when you walk into schools, it looks so carceral, right? With like metal detectors, students getting searched, cops everywhere, that carceral setting, and what's the impact, the psychological impact on young people as a result. So there are lots of studies about the trauma of policing on Black children in the community. And when you make schools carceral in this way, you have taken away a place that was supposed to be safe for young people. So Amir and Harold, you all have done a lot of looking at this, but I just want to ask Amir for you to start and to give us your thoughts based off of your research on the impact.
Sure. Every child comes to school with their experiences, right? And community experiences of children, especially children of color, Black children with police, are different. I still tense up at the sight of police just based off my previous traumas. I've literally seen them beat up both my mother and father as a child, right? And just these different memories. I've been harassed, I've been pulled over and different things. So when I saw a police officer at school, those are the emotions that come up. So it's no surprise that some research actually confirms that students, especially Black students, feel less welcome by the school, by just the presence of police, right? And then the experiences we know ignite that even more. So, research confirms that the best interest of students is actually the supporters, right? And it's nothing worse when you have, I remember a student describing every day when she got to school and she saw 2 police cars at her school, right? And how that made her not want to go to school. Parents talking about how, especially if they're undocumented or different things, that's not a welcoming environment. That's not, something that makes you want to enter a building. So the research confirms that as well.
Reyna, do you want to chime in here and give your thoughts?
Well, I just was thinking about, thank you for that, not less like the psychological impacts, but just more with thinking about like longer term societal change. I don't know how many of us on the call would consider ourselves abolitionists, but just, like the way we think about the proliferation of prisons makes prisons just a permanent fixture of our society. The proliferation of police in schools, I think for youth, it kind of has a potential to stifle their own imagination around like what justice looks like and what harm repair looks like. And so I think that's why we're just the youth for more generations, and even like ourselves and our families are getting socialized into the idea that we need cops to address these issues, and we can't depend on ourselves and on community processes to address harm and hold ourselves accountable. So I just think it has that effect as well. The more that we see them, the more they seem like natural parts of society when they don't have to be. So I think it's stifling imagination as to how community accountability and care can look like for youth. Although, obviously we see tons of them who are just saying, y'all are screwing it up as adults. We want a different world. So I'm glad that their imagination isn't stifled too much, but I think that's one psychological impact, is seeing them as permanent cops is permanent.
Yeah, I wanted to just, on this point, step back a minute and just go back to the framing of the school to prison pipeline. So oftentimes when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, we think about ways in which young people are funneled either directly or indirectly or immediately or eventually into some contact with the justice system. And that is a serious problem. But one other, I tend to think about it even more broadly than that, in that what we now know is that harsh discipline, unfair discipline also has an impact on student success. So even where students don't end up being arrested or don't end up being cited, what tends to happen as a result of harsh discipline, and including discipline involving police, is that kids lose their positive connection to school. We know that there's growing evidence that kids tend to become disengaged or drop out, or even when they finish, they become less successful in school and less engaged with school when they have a negative experience with school discipline. So that's another thing to think about, not just the possibility of having a criminal justice record, but the possibility of being derailed from those positive, hopeful things that we talked about in the beginning that school is supposed to encourage, facilitate, and represent.
Yeah. So we're at the point where we've talked about a lot of this, a lot of the contours, a lot of the things that youth defenders can do to engage in this. But I want to go to the end. Like I want to know, like, how do we just like solve this? Like, what are the solutions to this dynamic? Like, what if we could just like snap our fingers and do something different and all of us go pursue some other career that has nothing to do with oppression? I'd be a wedding planner. If we could all just get there, right? What are the solutions? And I'm going to start with Amir. Amir, from your viewpoint, what are the solutions here?
Solutions that, I wouldn't be a wedding planner, but I'd be like a travel writer or something, living my best life. I think we don't have to go too far into our imaginations. Just a few generations ago, at least here in Los Angeles, where the school police department was started like in the 60s. But still just 20 years ago, well, maybe 30 years ago, 2 generations ago, it was normal to not have police just stationed at every school, right? And it was not the end of the world. So we have to understand there was a time before school police, right? And we're fighting to create a world where there'll be a time after them. Even in this world where youth are perceived to be much more dangerous and threatening. And the research shows, aside from the mass shootings happening, which are not the problem of, it's a symptom of a larger problem, and the fact that the children have access to these weapons of war and death, right? But adolescent behavior really hasn't changed that much, aside from like what the social media will show. So we haven't always needed police, and we can go back to a world where we understand that we keep each other safe, we keep each other protected, and where we accept that the police aren't there to keep students safe. And last thing I'll share on that is the case of what happened in Parkland, Florida, where the parents sued because the police officer failed to protect their children. And it was seen in the video, circling around the building while the mass shooter was there. And Uvalde, we don't even have to talk about that. But in Parkland, when this happened, the parents sued the police officer and the law enforcement department. And the argument that the officer made was that actually he doesn't have a duty to protect children. Even though people swear that police serve and protect, they argued that they only have the duty to protect people in their custody who they arrest, right? Which they argued successfully, right? So understanding that the police aren't there to protect our children, we can go back to a world where they're no longer there depriving schools of much needed resources that need to go to support students in their education.
Thanks, Amir. That failure to protect, yes, I have war stories about that particular argument. Reyna, what do you think? What are the solutions?
I don't know the solutions, but I know that who needs to be engaged in them are the youth who have these experiences, their families, and their communities. And so I would just want to see us as lawyers, as a profession continue to kind of humble ourselves and try to work in solidarity with people who are organizing around us, who have their direct experience, because so long, you know, we know that simply changing a law or a school district policy, that's not going to get at it. So we need to continue to leverage our tools and resources as attorneys to build the power of community to continue fighting for generations to come. So I think more partnerships and true authentic relationships between legal advocates and communities impacted is necessary to come to a solution.
True authentic relationships. I love it. Absolutely love it. And speaking of relationships, Harold, you're the chair of the National School to Prison Pipeline Committee for the ACLU. And I know that the ACLU does lots of partnering with lots of different stakeholders, whether it be youth and families or other like youth defenders or other organizations. Can you talk about those partnerships and just how people who are listening here could get involved from that strategy point?
Well, I mean, the ACLU is one of many organizations that actually work with people in community on education issues and education equity. So the framing for our work is education equity, what creates an equitable environment, and the critique of you know, police and harsh the misuse of police in schools is a piece of that larger picture. That schools should be a place where sort of equity happens and where equity is the goal of the work in every area. And so, you know, there is involvement, of course, in the sort of defensive work that is keeping bad things from happening. But also there's the involvement in sort of the proactive work and arguing for the right use of resources and the right kind of supports that go to schools. So we have to be prepared to do both. And I know that after there's a school shooting, the usual response from public agencies is to sort of harden schools and increase that kind of pressure on schools, which actually doesn't help with what's critically needed. So yeah, I mean, you know, our offices are kind of like what Amir and his crew there do. They're promoting positive things and they're trying to block the negative things, reducing the LA Unified School District's police budget, but also increasing the arts budget, So, you know, our programs, both in the ACLU and outside of the ACLU, are a mixture of those things. There's a balance of those things. So we organize to say what we are for and what are the supports that students need to exist, in order to develop and prosper in schools. And I do think that you know, all of the disruption and the sadness, you know, that's connected with COVID should give us more of an advantage in that discussion about what kids actually need and what kinds of supports supports and resources they actually need in schools. You know, it's estimated that some 200,000 teenagers lost a parent or a caregiver due to COVID. Those kids are, you know, often in school or around school or in school part of the time. And so we have to be able to sort of say, well, wait a minute. This need has always been there. We have to some extent long misallocated resources, but this gives us an argument, an extra reason to say we need to be pumping more resources, student supportive resources into schools. And, you know, it's not just the ACLU that's calling for that. There are many other organizations, but where we have offices that are actively engaged in it, I mean, the goal is equity and fair treatment of kids.
Absolutely. So I think that, you know, like when I ask, like, what's the solution? It's like, I mean, it's kind of simple, but really hard to get there. But I think that a key component of it, I think a lot of people would say, is to get cops out of schools. And so, well, you know, before I go there, Chris, did you have thoughts about what the solutions are?
Well, actually, you know, Ebony, maybe, you know, it ties into where you want to go next, this notion of getting cops out of school. But look,
Cool.
you know, I would, you know, build upon what, you know, Harold, Reyna, and Amir have said, but especially this notion of, look, we know what works. And we might have even said it previously in previous webinars in terms of what works for school safety and public safety is a public health approach. It's just worth naming, that is attentive to the development of healthy, positive, meaningful relationships between adults and children. It's about giving youth voices. It's about a trauma-informed response. It's about equity that Harold talked about, racial equity. You know, also, though, in a very practical way, we also know what works, which is all the things that Harold and Amir talk about in their report, having more counselors, more social workers, social emotional learning, vocational opportunities. I love this idea, arts programs, smaller classes. So it's this idea, if we know what works, advocating for that. But I really wanted to tie it to what Reyna said about really giving voice to young people and to families. And so I think about it as a defender, being in a defender office. What can I do to support that movement, to educate that movement? And so as lawyers, you know, at Georgetown in the Juvenile Justice Clinic, we've had an opportunity to, I don't even know if partner is the right word, but to hide behind the scenes for some youth advocacy organizations, right? And provide them with what they need to make the argument, to be the front voice around the police-free schools movement, for example. It's just one of examples, or for policy changes that would prohibit the arrest of children in school for simple assault, for fighting at schools, like that. But you know, the voice of that argument, the testimony is coming from the young people who go to city council and make those arguments and write and submit their written pleadings. But there's opportunities for lawyers to be behind the scenes and help, you know, educate them on the legal questions, to help them draft their own testimony, but again, in their voices, but to give them that knowledge, to provide information about alternative resources, to prepare infographics that help them articulate and visualize what it is that youth and families want. So I just wanted to share that really over the last sort of 5 years, I've been sort of honestly just sort of educated on how to be behind the scenes and be the support, to be the accomplice in this work for youth advocates and family advocates who are going to speak out on these.
I would also add that some of the work that advocates can do is really just good old-fashioned sort of know your rights workshops and whatever. I'm really stunned by, you know, the large numbers of sort of parents and guardians who don't know how to exercise their theoretical rights in schools, whether it's to gain access to student records or their rights in the discipline process, and they're just fed a bunch of crap by school administrators or intimidated into silence. So, you know, we certainly do that kind of work, but I think that lawyers can play an important role in that kind of education work in partnership with people in communities. I mean, it's nothing radical about it. It's old-fashioned sort of like public education, but it's public education about how the law impacts you and your child and your loved ones, and how you can exercise your rights when you can. I mean, it's not, there's some bad situations that it's hard to correct, but there are many others where, you know, you can do something.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Chris, I just want to make sure that we put a very clear messaging for youth defenders about the role that they can play in this work, right? And so, do you mind just giving some thought? I mean, you've already given a lot of really good practical things that youth defenders can do, but do you have others that you think would be good to share?
Yeah, I mean, building upon that notion of working behind the scenes, which I think is the frame of all of this. I mean, it means that like everything that we do changes and shifts in order to promote and support this work. So I think about, you know, my client interview, maybe not my initial client interview, but subsequent client interviews. I think we as defenders, we get so much tunnel vision, defending the question at hand, the legal question, which of course is what we should do, but are we asking those broader questions, right? About what is your relationship? Like, how are you, what is good? What's going well at school? What's not going well at school? Do you have police in school? What's your relationship with police in schools? What are your ideas about fixing police in schools? That's a part of that rapport building, but it also creates a space for young people to talk about maybe some of these issues, you know, that they don't ever have an opportunity to talk about elsewhere. So I think inviting that, and it's relevant to, it becomes relevant to, and we'll talk about this when we talk about policing as trauma, but it becomes relevant to some of the interrogation questions and the Fourth Amendment questions, but it's broader than just what happened to you when you got arrested. It's much bigger than that. Tell me about your culture, the culture of policing. And I think that sets us up really, really nicely. I think another thing, you know, I talked already about getting school regulations, school discipline regulations. I think that's important, but then also getting any existing MOU or absence thereof of police in schools, right? And the defender is like, well, why is that relevant? I mean, not why, I don't mean it to say it quite that way. It seems a bit beyond our scope because it seems so reform-based, and it is reform-based. And I hope that each of our offices has, you know, a team of defenders who are looking systemically about reform. But even in our individual cases, I wanna know what that MOU says or doesn't say about the presence of police in schools and the authority and the scope of authority to make an arrest, to discipline in school, so that I can challenge that also in my individual cases. So I think all of this information that we're talking about is useful systemically, and we as defenders have a role to play there, but also everything we learn can be helpful in advocating on behalf of a kid in an individual delinquency case at the time of arrest.
Beautiful. So we've come near to the end of our time. However, before we end, you know, it's hard times, like, you know, in all kinds of ways. It's just very, very hard times. And so what I would like is if each of our panelists would take about 30 seconds to just tell the youth defender community about why they should continue to persist in this work around school discipline and around SROs. If you could just give us a little light to carry us through a little bit further down the journey. So I'm going to go in reverse order this time. I'm going to start with Reyna and ask her to just chat with us for a second.
I would say because there are youth and parents and communities who are energized around reform, like they're experiencing all these oppressive systems within the education, or repressive policies and practices within the educational system, and yet many are organized and like ready and could use the support and accompliceship of legal professionals. So people are ready to work and just need and perhaps could use a boost from legal expertise. So there's people out there ready to work with us.
Thanks, Reyna. Harold?
I mean, I think these are weird and uncertain times, but I am not depressed at all about the prospects of moving forward on these issues. And once again, it's really a question of sort of what issues you highlight, what experiences you highlight, what it is that you demand of schools in terms of, you know, how kids are treated and respected. You know, it does make any kind of reform challenging when you have all this anti-CRT and anti-gay nonsense going on in schools. Mm-hmm. But usually what you'll find is that in those schools that some, you know, just a minority of parents' voices are being sort of elevated in a certain kind of way when a lot of other, you know, folks in that same community are being ignored. And so it is a question of, like, you know, coming forward and making demands that school districts actually do the work that they supporting young people that they should be doing. And once again, I mean, I think the public saw the failure of school security methods, the standard ones, the hardening of schools in Uvalde, and they're going to see it more in other places as well. So we don't have to completely make that case. I mean, they monitored students' social media. They had these so-called threat assessment teams. They had police in schools. They had all of that. And it, you know, in the end, it wasn't organized to protect or respect the folks who work in those school communities, students and their teachers. You know, we also know that, you know, COVID has really, you know, sort of created a lot of stress and drama and trauma in communities. And so, you know, we can take that and say, this is what our kids need in school. These are the kinds of resources. So, you know, we do have arguments on our side. I don't think it's, so I don't feel at all depressed about the prospects of change.
That's beautiful hope. That's beautiful hope.
Well, I mean, I've had experience,
I'll take
even
it.
within my own state, that the net result of struggle is not always bad. Sometimes you get something good out of it.
Yep.
But you got to be organized.
Definitely. Yeah, just want to send gratitude for y'all for inviting us, and shout out to all the youth defenders. Want to encourage you, you have to continue to do the work, because oftentimes you're the only one fighting, right? I know that was my personal experience as a youth when I got a public defender. I know it was my experience when I was working in the public defender's office. And Harold mentioned those bad lawyers on the other side. Like, you know, so it is literally a fight of good versus evil. And these are children we're talking about, right? So it's that James Baldwin quote about, these are all of our children. We will profit for, pay for whatever they become. And, you know, it's a process. I mean, the Gault Center, the Gault decision, right, didn't exist a few decades ago. So just know that history will look back on us as the champions, because the system is now cracked with the uprising that started. And we can talk more radically about what the world we want to create. And you all have to fight to create that world.
Thank you, Amir. And then Chris?
All right, I'll just close this out with the kids, which is just to say, I get all of my hope from working with young people. I've been so moved and inspired by youth activism, you know, throughout, you know, decades and generations. But right now, in these moments, you know, they have been extraordinarily. And so what I like to say, if you want to know how to make the world a better place for children, just ask them. They can tell you and they can guide you.
The perfect note to end on. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. We so appreciate you. We'll catch y'all next month. Hope to see you soon. Bye, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, guys. All right,
Thank you
Kirsten.
for